This is from Top of Lawyer College, Certificate 4, BIB402, Bible History, and this is Lesson 6. Now, again, this lesson is going to be a reasonably short one from my perspective as a teacher. You may want to spend a bit more time on it. The blue stripe section of your book has 3 questions. And what I encourage you to do as we begin this one is grab your highlighter, make sure you've got it there. And when you see something important, highlight it, then you can list it down. And remembering that that's the technique we're actually talking about. What are the key words? Highlight them, list them, retell it, summarise it in your own words. So what we're looking at in the assessment is we're looking at some key ideas about the Messiah. We want 4, and there's a lot more than that. You'll want to identify one of the prophetic one of the prophecies that point to the Messiah, and pick out 3 points from that. So there will be a list of some prophetic, some messianic prophecies in this lesson. So you'll probably want to highlight them, look them up when you finish this video, and then work out what it actually says about the Messiah. And then the other one is, the Messiah is about bringing freedom. How can you help to bring about freedom in your community? You might give some practical examples. It may be anything from helping set up a health centre, doing rehab, certainly so. We know people, church leaders have done that. It may be helping people who are sick, visiting the elderly. It could be a whole variety of social problems. Pick one, be practical. Okay, let's turn to the book now. We're on page, make sure I get the right book, not the answer book. We're on page 33, lesson 6, the coming of Messiah. So there's a number of prophecies, prophetic messages that ancient rabbis identified as being messianic, that they speak about God's anointed one, a special person appointed by God to carry out the work ordained by God. So we've got a few here, and one of the things you might want to highlight now, and I'll pull up my highlighter. You might want to highlight that, that. I always get this problem where it does that. So, and one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is stop, go read the Bible and come back before you continue on. So, this lesson's only 2 pages in your book, but there is a fair bit of work to do. So we have a number of prophecies, and this is not an exhaustive list. I think one of my old study Bibles talks about hundreds and hundreds of prophetic words. And some of them, when you read them in context of what they would have meant to people originally, don't look like they're actually talking about the Messiah to come. One example would be one that I used in one of the daily reflections recently, which is Peter on the day of Pentecost, quoting Psalm 16. Now, when David originally wrote it, he's actually thanking God and saying, you were before my eyes at all time, and I know you won't let me die. You won't let your chosen one. And in the process of preserving that psalm as part of the collection of the psalms, those words in translation to Greek were translated, given a slightly different sense, that at the time of the translation of the Old Testament into Greek, a couple hundred years before Jesus, they were starting to expect the Messiah. So I went, hang on, this, anything to do with David might actually be talking about this. And certainly when Peter uses the psalm on the day of Pentecost, he's talking about, you will not let your chosen one suffer death. He's actually using it as a prophetic word for the resurrection of Christ. So some of those things change over time, but here we're going to deal with a number of the key points. So, and the first one, Genesis 49, Jacob, so this is right back in Patriarchs period, is blessing his 12 sons, but part of the blessing, so he said his son Judah, that his descendants would be rulers, and that one of his descendants would be an ultimate ruler. So, pause, have a look at that. And it basically says this: that Judah will hold the royal scepter, his descendants will always rule, nations will beg him tribute and bow in obedience before him. Now, Judah isn't the oldest son, but he's the one who gets that blessing. And certainly later on, the expectation would be that this actually talks about the Messiah. God promised another Moses, Deuteronomy 18, and encourage you to read that. And we know there are a number of other prophets after Moses, including the biggies like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And Joshua led the children of Israel into the promised land. Now, at the time of the writing of the New Testament, Jewish people were still looking forward to the coming of this prophet like Moses. There are some Jews that are still doing that, even though the Jewish expectation today has pretty much dropped off. But again, pause the video, read Deuteronomy 18 and see what it says. One of the next themes that comes up is that the person will be Jesse's descendant. So Isaiah talks about, in chapter 11, a ruler who would be a descendant of Jesse. So Jesse was the father of King David, and that this person would rule with true justice, true faith, and he would bring true peace. The lion would lay down with the lamb. Read Isaiah 11, 1-10. Okay, you've done that. We know that this was one of those things that was seen to be absolutely essential for the coming anointed one, for the coming Messiah. So we see that as being descendant of David, and that's one of the reasons why we have in the Gospels those lineages tracing Jesus' family back to King David and beyond. The next point is that the Messiah would be somebody who would suffer and be rejected. Now, you don't expect this. You expect the king to be large and in charge. But in a couple of places, and there are a number of parts of Isaiah, and we just list one here, where the section Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, which often gets read either at Easter or Christmas, refers, it's often read as referring to the nation as a whole, but, it said the servant of God would be rejected and despised. And we see that as Christians in the person of Christ. So now would be a good time to turn to the blue section, do those two assessment tasks. Now that you've actually read those four, just pick one of them for assessment task 14B and pick out 3 points at least. You might find more about what it says about Messiah. So what do the people, so you've done that? Okay, restart. What do people expect? And the expectation was he's going to be king. Okay, he's going to be king. He's going to be Judah. He's going to be like Moses. He's going to be David's descendant. Suffering is not something people like to think about. But the common expectation was that it would be a person of power, a person of status, and a person of national importance. This is what people expected. And the people of Jesus' time saw the coming of the Messiah in terms of these ideas about an earthly king. And here's a question for you. Jot some notes down. Do people still think this way in the church? Do they want leaders? Do they want pastors, ministers who are people of power, status, and importance? Interesting. Okay, pause, write down some thoughts. Okay, and as we restart, Jesus radically changed the idea of what a leader was. He redefined leadership in terms of his own actions. So he's not powerful, great status, great importance. His humility, self-giving, servanthood are the things which he sees and teaches us are most important in leadership. And in Roman society at the time, it would be unthinkable that a great person would act below their dignity. If you had dignity, you used it. If you had authority, you used it. You were serious with the use of power. None of this stuff. That was for slaves. They didn't have a choice. So Jesus radically changes it. And a couple of commentators have actually picked that up as a major change in what we think is important about leaders, but it comes from Jesus. It's also one of the reasons why somebody like former Bishop Tom Wright, a New Testament scholar, has actually said the expectation that people had about Jesus being the Messiah, or about the Messiah, that Jesus met none of the popular expectations at the time. And at the same time, all of his disciples, the apostles, started referring to him as the Messiah, and he wasn't a person of status, power, or importance. And he says that that's one of the best arguments that he knows for the reality of the resurrection of Christ from the dead, because he led no armies, he formed no laws, he opened no school of study. But the one thing that he did that nobody was expecting, that was not on anybody's horizon, or even a glimmer of imagination, he had to have done something that made people go, wow, he is unlike any other person. And that's what Tom Wright argues, is it had to be the resurrection. There was nothing else that really stood out in the same way. So, as we said, they expected worldly power. But Jesus says, I did not come to be served, but to serve. And as Paul writes in Philippians, Jesus emptied himself of his divine power, emptied himself of all but love, and depended upon the Father to give him the Holy Spirit. So yeah, and in the words of the man Kennedy, he emptied himself of all but love and bled for Adam's helpless race. You know, Christ gives himself in love to all of us. Jesus spent his time with the people his society thought were not important, but low-class people. People like lepers, foreigners, Jews, the turncoats who worked for Romans. And he spent time with women, which was unheard of in that society at that time. So they wanted a national leader. People were expecting a national leader to throw the Romans out and set up a Jewish state. Jesus refused that political role. And of course, Jesus is the Lord of everyone. And in fact, Jesus commands his people to bring the outsiders in. And that is, in fact, true freedom. So the New Testament becomes a story of freedom with the Messiah, a story of our freedom gained through Jesus. We're freed from sin. We're free to do things like healing the sick and caring for those who are vulnerable. And here are some of the things that we're set free from. Slavery to sin, the law, free to bring good news to the poor, liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. We're enabled to live as free people. So those are some of the freedoms that we're given. And I encourage you now to go to, when I finish here, to go to assessment task 15 and answer that question: how can you bring freedom to your community? And basically the freedom that we are able to give people comes from the freedom that we are given. Now, we do know that this messianic expectation does not survive much beyond the New Testament. There's a scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian where, oh, here's the Messiah, oh, there's the Messiah, the gourd of the Messiah's shoe. They're all chasing around. There was a sense where, even though that's said in jest, that people were looking for messiahs left, right and centre at the time, and there were lots of them rose. Even some of the people arrested around the time of Jesus' crucifixion thought that they were the Messiah. Any rebel set up and say, well, I'm here to fulfill the messianic prophecy. They were trying to be the political leader, the general, the people who are going to kick the Romans out and bring in the new rule. And eventually we see some of it collapse a bit with the destruction of Jerusalem in the Roman punitive conquest in 90 AD, when Jerusalem's put under siege and then the temple and the city are destroyed. But again and again, there would be people rise up. And the last major one was the son of the star, Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 AD. And when he was brutally put down, Jerusalem was razed to the ground yet again, and the Romans built it as a fully Roman Greek city, and if you were Jewish, you weren't allowed to come anywhere near it. And it's about that time that all expectation of this political great leader who kicked the Romans out, it pretty much died away at that time. So within the Jewish tradition, messianic expectation, yes, these things are known, but it's been there, but it's not been as major a part of their expectation as it was in the what was in this first century period. And largely because what they thought they were going to get, they didn't get. And, the hope is frittered away. From a Christian perspective, we sit there and go, well, maybe what you ought to think about is that the Messiah did come, but wasn't who you expected him to be. Don't go there. But yeah, the Christian perspective is, yes, these things were fulfilled, and it's in the person of Christ. One of the things I have noticed as I've enjoyed reading some rabbinic and other Jewish scholarly interpretation of the Old Testament books, but there will be quite often these passages which are regularly seen as messianic prophecies, things like Psalm 23, which sounds awfully like somebody being crucified, that the normal Jewish interpretation will pick up a scholarly or rabbinic tradition that interprets it in a way that isn't messianic, just to be different from those Christians. And it's sadly been part of the separation of the church and mainstream Judaism in the early years of the New Testament, that when people separate, when groups separate, they tend to identify themselves by what they have different with the other people. See that in churches, denominational splits. No, we are not like that. Or if a congregation splits or somebody leaves, no, they're like that, I'm like this. We're right, they're wrong. And you'll hear both sides say that. Whereas ultimately we do need to come under the authority of Christ, accept the hope and the love that he brings. So that's the theme of Messiah, and that's the end of this video. Thank you very much.